If one German warning had been taken seriously in early 1943, thousands of American soldiers would not have died in the deserts of North Africa. That warning did not come from Berlin. It did not come from an analyst. It came from the most experienced battlefield commander Germany had left in the West, Erwin Rommel. And it was ignored. 3 weeks after crushing U.S. forces at the Kasserine Pass, Rommel reached a conclusion that should have reshaped the campaign. The Americans he had just defeated were not inherently weak. They were unprepared, poorly led, disorganized, and most dangerously for Germany, they were capable of learning at a speed Rommel had not seen before. If given time, he believed, they would not break again. The German High Command chose to believe the opposite. In February 1943, the United States Army suffered its first major defeat of the war against Germany. At Kasserine Pass in central Tunisia, nearly 34,000 American troops were scattered across an exposed front stretching more than 100 miles. They were commanded by officers promoted too quickly, coordinating units that had never trained together, under doctrines borrowed from peacetime manuals. When German armor struck, the result was panic. Units retreated without orders, artillery fired blindly, communications collapsed. In less than a week, over 6,500 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. Rommel saw all of it. He saw American tank crews abandon vehicles intact. He saw infantry break contact at the first penetration. He saw command posts overrun because no one thought to move them. To Rommel, this was not courage failing, it was leadership. And leadership, unlike manpower, could change overnight. Rommel reported that the Americans were inexperienced, but not inferior. He warned that their industrial base, combined with rapid adaptation, made delay dangerous. Strike them again immediately, he argued, before they reorganized, before new leadership imposed order, before discipline replaced confusion. He believed that if Germany hesitated, the next encounter would not resemble Kasserine. Berlin hesitated. Instead of concentrating forces for a decisive follow-up, German command diverted units, argued over priorities, and underestimated the speed of American reform. They assumed Kasserine represented the American Army's natural state. They assumed fear would repeat itself. They assumed wrong. What they did not fully account for was a change made in silence, without announcement, inside the American command structure. On March 6, 1943, U.S. Second Corps received a new commander, George S. Patton Jr. Patton did not bring new tanks, he did not bring new artillery, he did not bring reinforcements in meaningful numbers. He brought discipline, and he brought consequences. Within 72 hours, Patton removed or sidelined over 100 officers. Helmets were required at all times. Sloppy dress was punished. Retreat without orders became a court-martial offense. Artillery officers were ordered to coordinate fires across unit boundaries. Infantry commanders were forced to rehearse counterattacks, not withdrawals. Patton did not ask if units were ready. He ordered them to become ready. This transformation occurred in less than 3 weeks. Rommel noticed. German reconnaissance reported increased patrol activity. Artillery responses became faster, more accurate. American units stopped retreating at first contact. They held ground, fell back deliberately, then counterattacked. The behavior had changed. The equipment had not. Rommel issued another warning. He told his generals that the Americans were adapting faster than any enemy Germany had faced since 1939. He cautioned that the next engagement would not be another Kasserine. He urged caution, preparation, respect. The warning was dismissed as excessive caution from a commander already strained by logistics and illness. By mid-March 1943, German forces prepared to attack again, this time near the small Tunisian town of El Guettar. The objective was straightforward: break U.S. Second Corps, reopen maneuver space, and restore momentum in southern Tunisia. German planners expected a repeat performance: American collapse, rapid exploitation, minimal resistance. They based that expectation on February's evidence. They ignored March's reality. What followed would expose the cost of that decision, not in theory, in bodies. In early March 1943, the ground around El Guettar looked deceptively forgiving. Rolling hills, shallow wadis, sparse vegetation. To German planners, it appeared ideal for armor. To the Americans, it was a test they could not afford to fail twice. U.S. Second Corps now occupied a defensive line roughly 20 miles long. At its center stood the 1st Infantry Division. To its flanks, elements of the 34th Infantry Division and the 9th Infantry Division. In total, just over 76,000 American troops faced a German force of approximately 45,000, including veterans from the 10th Panzer Division and elements of the Afrika Korps. On paper, the Germans still held qualitative superiority. But paper did not account for behavior. Patton's reforms followed a pattern. First, command clarity. Orders were simplified. Objectives were defined in single sentences. Second, artillery centralization. Instead of battery-by-battery responses, fires were massed. Time-on-target techniques were drilled relentlessly. Third, morale through control. Fear was not debated, it was disciplined. Distances mattered. Artillery observers were placed forward, sometimes within 500 meters of the line. Anti-tank guns were dug in with overlapping fields of fire, spaced no more than 300 yards apart. Infantry platoons rehearsed fallback positions measured in yards, not miles. Nothing was left vague. This was not improvisation, it was doctrine, enforced at speed. German intelligence noticed increased radio traffic but misread it as confusion. They observed American movement at night and assumed withdrawal. They intercepted messages calling for artillery registration and assumed panic. Each observation was filtered through February's assumptions. Rommel argued otherwise. He pointed out that American artillery responses now arrived within minutes, not hours. He noted that reconnaissance probes were being met aggressively. He warned that the Americans were learning how to fight combined arms warfare in real time. His subordinates were unconvinced. On March 23, 1943, German forces initiated their attack. At dawn, over 50 German tanks advanced toward American positions south of El Guettar. They expected to punch through within hours. Instead, they entered a kill zone. American artillery fired nearly 6,000 rounds in the first day, not randomly, precisely. Time-on-target barrages landed simultaneously, saturating assembly areas. Anti-tank guns engaged at pre-measured ranges. Within the first 90 minutes, at least 30 German tanks were destroyed or disabled. This was not luck, it was preparation. When German infantry attempted to exploit perceived gaps, they encountered American units that did not flee, they held. When ordered to fall back, they did so in sequence, covering each other. When German armor paused to regroup, American counterattacks followed within hours, not days. The contrast with Kasserine was absolute. At Kasserine, American units had retreated up to 15 miles in a single day. At Guettar, the line bent less than 1,000 yards. At Kasserine, artillery fired in isolation. At Guettar, it fired as a system. At Kasserine, command posts were overrun. At Guettar, they relocated under fire without losing control. German losses mounted. By March 25th, the 10th Panzer Division had lost over 50% of its operational tanks in the sector. Infantry casualties exceeded 1,200. Momentum stalled. Requests for reinforcement were denied. Fuel shortages worsened. Air support was inconsistent. Rommel recognized the pattern immediately. This was no longer an enemy that collapsed under pressure. This was an enemy that absorbed pressure and responded with force. He reiterated his warning. Delay favored the Americans. Every day gave them more coordination, more confidence, more effectiveness. The response from higher command was unchanged. German planners continued to view El Guitar as an anomaly, a local success, not a strategic shift. They believed another push, with more determination, would restore the balance. They ordered continued pressure despite mounting evidence to the contrary. For the Americans, the lesson was already learned. Leadership had changed behavior. Behavior had changed outcomes, and outcomes were now changing the war. The decision to ignore Rommel's warning did not just misjudge an opponent, it misjudged time, and time in Tunisia was measured in lives. The decisive moment did not come with an order to attack. It came with a refusal to stop. In late March 1943, after the failure at El Guitar was no longer deniable, German command faced a choice: withdraw and consolidate, preserve experienced units, accept that the Americans were no longer the force of February, or continue pressing an opponent who was improving by the week under conditions that increasingly favored Allied firepower and logistics. Rommel recommended withdrawal. He argued that the window had closed, that the Americans now coordinated artillery faster than German armor could maneuver, that their infantry no longer dissolved under pressure, that their leadership cycle was accelerating while Germany's was stagnating. He warned that every additional engagement would cost irreplaceable veterans for no strategic gain. The recommendation was rejected. What was taken away in that decision was time, and time mattered more than terrain, because time was allowing the Americans to do what Rommel feared most: normalize competence. By April 1943, U.S. Second Corps no longer required extraordinary discipline to function. The systems Patton imposed were becoming habit. Fire plans were routine. Counterattacks were expected. Fear was managed, not indulged. German forces, by contrast, were being ground down. Between March and May 1943, Axis units in Tunisia lost over 100,000 men killed or wounded. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Fuel shortages immobilized armor. Air superiority slipped decisively to the Allies. By the time withdrawal was finally authorized, it was too late to execute cleanly. On May 13, 1943, the Axis surrender in Tunisia became official. More than 250,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms. It was one of the largest mass surrenders in German military history. The campaign was over. The Americans had not won because they outnumbered their enemy. They had not won because of superior tanks. They had won because leadership intervened early enough to prevent collapse, but late enough to expose a brutal truth. The casualties suffered before that intervention were avoidable. At Kasserine Pass, over 6,500 Americans became casualties in a single week. Most were not lost because the enemy was stronger. They were lost because command systems failed, because doctrine was unclear, because leadership hesitated to enforce standards until defeat forced its hand. Patton's arrival did not create courage, it imposed structure, and structure saved lives. German commanders understood this too late. Rommel understood it early. His warning was not philosophical, it was operational. He had seen this pattern before.
in France in 1940, in Britain's recovery after 1941. Armies did not need years to adapt, they needed direction. The cost of ignoring that lesson did not end in Tunisia. In July 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. American units advanced aggressively, coordinating armor, infantry, and artillery with a confidence absent 6 months earlier. German defenders noted the difference. In 1944, in Normandy, the pattern repeated. Static defenses failed. Counterattacks were met with overwhelming fire. Coordination, not experience, defined success. By then, the institutional lesson was institutionalized, but the men lost learning it were gone. This is the weight of leadership decisions in war, not abstract outcomes, not arrows on a map, but days of delay measured in graves. The transformation of the U.S. Army in North Africa proves that defeat was not inevitable, it was permitted, and once corrected, it was never repeated in the same way again. Rommel warned his generals after 3 weeks. They ignored him, and in doing so, they underestimated not just an enemy, but the speed at which leadership can change history and the human cost of waiting too long to act.